Elvis Presley was born on January 8, 1935, in Tupelo, Mississippi. Tupelo was a small town, and the Presley family lived on the poor end of it. Their house had 2 rooms, no indoor plumbing, no extra money for anything that wasn't necessary. Elvis and his parents, Vernon and Gladys, lived the way a large number of people in rural Mississippi lived during that period, getting by, day to day, without much room for anything else. But the material poverty of that life is only part of the picture. The other part is the social world that surrounded it, because Mississippi in 1935 was a state built on racial separation, and that separation touched every part of daily life in ways that are hard to fully grasp from a distance. Segregation in the American South was not just a set of attitudes, it was a legal structure. It told Black Americans where they could sit on a bus, where they could eat, where they could drink water, where their children could go to school, what jobs they could apply for, and which neighborhoods they were allowed to live in. These were not informal customs that polite people ignored. They were enforced rules, backed by courts and police, and in many cases by the threat of violence from private citizens who faced no consequences for it. In Mississippi, the system was particularly rigid. The state had some of the most severe segregation laws in the country. Black residents were routinely denied the right to vote through literacy tests, poll taxes, and outright intimidation. Interracial relationships were illegal. Public spaces were divided completely. A Black man who looked at a white woman the wrong way, or who failed to show the right kind of deference to a white stranger on the street, could face serious consequences, up to and including death, with no legal accountability for whoever was responsible. This is the world Elvis was born into, not as a distant fact, but as the immediate environment around him. What made his particular situation slightly unusual was the neighborhood. The Presleys lived in an area where poor white families and poor Black families were neighbors in the most literal sense, sharing the same streets, the same level of poverty, the same daily difficulties. The formal walls of segregation were present, but economic desperation has a way of creating small spaces where those walls become thinner. Not because anyone had decided to challenge the system, but because survival doesn't always leave room for careful maintenance of social boundaries. Elvis grew up hearing Black voices, Black music, and Black church traditions from a very early age. The First Assembly of God church that his family attended had a worship style that was loud, physical, and emotionally open. It had more in common with the Black Pentecostal tradition than with the quieter, more controlled white Protestant services that were more typical of the era. Elvis sang in that environment. He absorbed that approach to music and performance before he was old enough to understand that he was absorbing something he was supposed to keep at arm's length. Across the street and in the surrounding area, the sounds of Black Southern life were part of the daily background. Gospel music from nearby churches, blues coming out of radios, work songs, spiritual music. All of it was present, and none of it required any special effort on Elvis's part to hear. He simply grew up surrounded by it. This matters because it explains something about who Elvis was before he became famous. By the time he walked into Sun's studio as a teenager, he wasn't discovering Black music for the first time. He had been living adjacent to it for his entire childhood. The musical instincts he had were formed in that environment, in that neighborhood, in those early years in Tupelo. None of this made him exceptional in terms of his racial attitudes. Growing up near Black neighbors in poverty does not automatically produce a person free of the prejudices of their time and place. It simply means the exposure was there from the beginning. What a person does with that exposure is a separate question. But it does mean that when people later try to describe Elvis as someone who had crossed into foreign territory by engaging with Black music and Black musicians, they were missing something important. For Elvis, that territory was never entirely foreign. It was part of where he started. The South he was born into was a society built on strict separation, and he was born on the poor white edge of it, close enough to the other side of that line to hear everything that was happening there. That proximity would shape everything that came after. When Elvis was 13 years old, the Presley family left Tupelo and moved to Memphis, Tennessee. Byrne and Presley had been struggling to find steady work, and Memphis represented a better chance. It was a larger city, more jobs, more opportunity. The family moved into a public housing project called Lauderdale Courts, which was designated for low-income white families. It wasn't much, but it was more stable than what they had left behind. Memphis in 1948 was a city of contradictions. It was one of the most racially divided cities in the South, with strict segregation enforced across nearly every public space. At the same time, it was one of the most musically alive cities in America, and much of that musical energy was coming directly from its black community. Beale Street was the center of that world. It was a stretch of road in the heart of Memphis where black-owned businesses, clubs, theaters, and music venues had built something genuinely remarkable. B.B. King was playing there. Rufus Thomas was on the radio. The blues had been developing in that neighborhood for decades, and by the late 1940s, it was evolving into something new, louder, more electric, more urgent. The music that would eventually become rock and roll was being assembled, piece by piece, on and around Beale Street. Elvis found it. He was a teenager with no money, no particular social status, and no obvious future, but he had ears, and he used them. He would go down to Beale Street and listen. He spent time in the record shops, including one run by a man named O.K. Houck, where he could hear music that wasn't getting played on mainstream white radio stations. He absorbed what he heard. Not as research, not as a deliberate project, but the way a young person absorbs anything they genuinely love, by spending as much time around it as possible. The music he was hearing was rhythm and blues, gospel, and the early sounds of what would become soul. Artists like Arthur Crudup, Wynonie Harris, and Roy Brown were making records that were raw, physical, and emotionally direct in a way that the polished pop music on mainstream radio simply wasn't. For a kid who had grown up in the church, who already understood music as something that was supposed to move people rather than just please them, this was familiar territory in a new form. At the same time, Elvis was navigating a very specific social reality. He was a white kid from a poor family attending Humes High School in Memphis, living in public housing. His family had very little. He dressed differently from the other kids at school. He favored clothes from Lansky Brothers on Beale Street, a store that catered primarily to black musicians and performers, and his style stood out in ways that made him something of an outsider among his white peers. That outsider status is worth noting. Elvis was not a popular or socially confident teenager. He was quiet in groups, uncertain of himself in most social situations. Music was the one area where he felt something close to certainty. He played guitar at home, sang constantly, and spent whatever time he could around the sounds that mattered to him, which increasingly meant the sounds coming out of the black neighborhoods of Memphis. His mother Gladys was the emotional center of his life during this period. Their relationship was extremely close, closer than most mothers and sons, and she was protective of him in ways that went beyond the ordinary. She walked him to school long past the age when other kids were walking alone. She worried about him constantly. In some ways, this closeness was a source of stability for a boy who had grown up with very little security. In other ways, it would shape his personality in lasting ways. The intense loyalty he showed to people around him throughout his life had its roots in that relationship. By the time Elvis was in his mid-teens, he was spending his afternoons and evenings immersed in Memphis music. He wasn't playing professionally or even semi-professionally yet. He was just listening, practicing, absorbing. The two musical worlds he was living between, the white gospel and country sounds of his church and family background, and the black blues and rhythm and blues sounds of Beale Street, were both fully present in him by this point. He wasn't yet sure what to do with that, but it was all there, waiting. The Memphis he grew up in had drawn a hard line between its two communities. Elvis grew up straddling that line, not because he had decided to make a statement, but simply because of where he had landed, what he had heard, and what he had loved. That combination would eventually change American music. But first, he was just a teenager in a housing project, listening. By the time Elvis was 15 or 16, Beale Street had become a regular part of his world. He wasn't there as a performer. He wasn't there with any professional ambition yet. He was there because the music pulled him in, and once he found it, he kept coming back. Beale Street in the late 1940s and early 1950s was unlike anywhere else in Memphis. The rest of the city operated under strict racial segregation. Separate schools, separate restaurants, separate everything. But Beale Street existed on slightly different terms. It was a black neighborhood, built and sustained by the black community of Memphis, and it operated with a degree of independence that was unusual for the South at that time. The businesses were black-owned, the clubs were run by black proprietors, the musicians were black artists who had built real careers on that street, on their own terms, within a system that was designed to limit them at every turn. For Elvis, walking into that world as a young white kid required a certain kind of personal comfort with crossing boundaries that most white Southerners of his generation simply didn't have. He wasn't making a political statement by being there. He was following the music. But the act of following it where it actually lived, rather than waiting for a sanitized version to reach him through approved channels, says something about how he was wired. The music he encountered on Beale Street was not what was playing on mainstream white radio. White radio in Memphis in the late 1940s and early 1950s played country, pop, and light jazz, polished, safe, emotionally contained. What was happening on Beale Street was the opposite of that. The blues being played in those clubs was direct and physical. It dealt with real experiences, hardship, loss, desire, survival, and it didn't soften those things for anyone's comfort. The performers moved on stage. The audiences responded. The whole thing was built around an emotional honesty that the mainstream music world of that era was actively trying to avoid. B.B. King was one of the central figures of that scene. He had come to Memphis from the Mississippi Delta and built his career playing clubs and broadcasting on WDIA, the radio station that had become the first in the country programmed entirely for black audiences. King's guitar playing was already distinctive, a combination of technical precision and raw feeling that would eventually make him one of the most influential musicians in American history. Elvis heard him. He saw him perform. In later years, King would speak about encountering a young Elvis on Beale Street, a white kid who stood out simply by being there, who listened carefully and treated the music and the musicians with genuine respect. Rufus Thomas was another presence on that scene. Thomas was a performer, radio DJ, and all-around entertainer who had been a fixture on Beale Street for years. He broadcast on WDIA and was one of the voices that brought black music to a Memphis audience that the mainstream radio stations were ignoring. Elvis listened to WDIA regularly. It was one of his primary sources for the music he was trying to understand and absorb. The record shops on and around Beale Street were also part of his education. He would spend time in those stores, listening to records, taking in artists that had no presence on the white radio stations he could have been listening to at home. This was not passive exposure. He was actively seeking out the music, making choices about where to spend his time and attention. What he was building during these years was not a performance style yet. It was something earlier than that, a musical vocabulary. He was learning the emotional language of a tradition that had developed over generations, in circumstances he had not lived and could not fully understand from the outside. He was taking it in as honestly as he could, which meant being present, being consistent, and genuinely interested rather than casually curious. The people he encountered on Beale Street during this period mostly remember him as quiet and attentive, not flashy, not trying to insert himself into the scene, just there, listening, watching, absorbing everything around him. He was also during this same period developing his own appearance. The clothes from Lansky Brothers that he had started wearing as a teenager, the styles associated with black musicians and performers rather than the standard dress of white Memphis teenagers, were becoming more deliberate. He knew what he liked, and he was moving toward it, even if he couldn't have explained exactly where it was all leading. Beale Street gave Elvis something that no formal music education could have provided. It gave him direct contact with a living tradition. At the moment, that tradition was evolving into something new. He was there for it, and it stayed with him for the rest of his life. In the summer of 1953, Elvis Presley walked into Sun's studio in Union Avenue in Memphis and paid $4 to record 2 songs. He told the receptionist, Marian Keisker, that he was recording them as a gift for his mother. That may have been partly true, but Keisker noticed something in his voice and made a note of his name for Sam Phillips, the man who ran the studio. Sam Phillips had been recording black artists in Memphis for several years by that point. He had worked with Howlin' Wolf, B.B. King, and Ike Turner, among others. He believed deeply in the music coming out of the black Southern tradition, and he had spent years trying to bring it to a wider audience with limited success. The commercial reality of American radio in the early 1950s meant that black artists could only go so far. The stations that reached the largest white audiences simply weren't playing their records. Phillips had said, in various forms, that if he could find a white singer who could carry the feeling of black music without losing it in the translation, the commercial possibilities would be significant. He wasn't looking to exploit the tradition. He was looking for a way to get the music heard by people who were being kept from it by the structure of American radio. Elvis, when Phillips finally heard him properly in 1954, seemed like that possibility. The session that changed everything happened in July 1954. Elvis was in the studio with guitarist Scotty Moore and bassist Bill Black, working through various songs without finding anything that felt right. Then, during a break, Elvis picked up his guitar and started playing That's All Right, a song recorded in 1946 by Arthur Crudup, a black blues musician from Mississippi. He wasn't performing it formally, he was just playing around with it, loose and relaxed. Moore and Black joined in. Phillips heard it from the control room and came out to ask what they were doing. When they told him they didn't know, he told them to start from the beginning and he would record it. Arthur Crudup had written and recorded That's All Right 8 years earlier and had seen very little return from it. He was part of a long pattern in the American music industry, where black artists created songs that generated money primarily for white-owned labels, publishers, and distributors. Crudup himself said publicly that he had written some of the biggest songs in the country and had almost nothing to show for it financially. That was not an exaggeration. It was the standard operating condition of the industry he worked in. When Elvis recorded That's All Right and it became a regional hit almost immediately, Crudup's name was on the writing credit, which was not always guaranteed in that era, but the financial reality remained deeply unequal. Elvis's version reached audiences and radio stations that Crudup's original never had access to, and the commercial structure around that success was not designed to route significant money back to the original artist. This is a real and uncomfortable part of the story. It does not disappear because Elvis genuinely loved the song, or because his recording of it introduced the music to people who had been denied access to it. Both things exist at the same time. The love was real. The inequality was also real. Acknowledging one does not cancel out the other. The same pattern appeared with Hound Dog. Big Mama Thornton recorded the original version in 1952. It was written by Jerry Lieber and Mike Stoller, and Thornton's recording was a significant rhythm and blues hit. Elvis recorded his version in 1956, and it became one of the best-selling singles in American history. Thornton received songwriter royalties only to the extent that the publishing structure of the era allowed, which was considerably less than what the song's commercial success would suggest was fair. She later spoke about this with understandable frustration. Elvis covered a significant number of songs originally recorded by black artists throughout his career. This was not unusual for white artists of the 1950s. It was in fact the standard practice of the industry. White artists routinely recorded versions of black artist songs, and those versions were the ones that got played on mainstream radio and sold in mainstream record stores. The term used for this was a cover record. The effect of it was that the creative source of the music was separated from most of its commercial reward. Where Elvis stood within this system is a question worth sitting with honestly. He did not create the system. He was 19 years old when he recorded That's All Right, with no power over how the music industry operated. But he moved through that system and benefited from it in ways that the original artist did not. What can also be said honestly is that his engagement with the music was not cynical. The artists he covered were artists he had listened to for years before he ever set foot in a recording studio. The borrowing was deep and genuine, which is part of why it worked. A purely imitative performance would not have produced what those early Sun recordings produced. Something real was being transmitted, even through a structure that distributed its rewards unfairly. That tension between genuine love for the music and participation in a system that treated its originators unjustly sits at the center of Elvis's relationship with black music. It is not resolved by pointing only to one side of it.
The music came from somewhere specific, from specific people, specific communities, specific experiences. Elvis knew that, and the industry around him made sure that knowing it did not translate into those people receiving what they were owed.
Fame changes the shape of a person's life very quickly. By 1956, Elvis Presley was one of the most recognized faces in America. The records were selling in numbers that surprised even the people at his label. The television appearances were drawing audiences that hadn't been seen before. The concert tours were selling out. Everything around him was moving fast, and the machine that managed that success, the bookings, the press, the money, the logistics, was growing larger by the month. Inside all of that, there was a smaller and more personal world. The people Elvis actually spent his time with, trusted, traveled with, and kept close. That inner circle said something real about who he was, separate from the public image that was being constructed around him. The group that eventually became known as the Memphis Mafia was not a formal organization. It was a collection of friends, cousins, acquaintances, and hired hands that grew up around Elvis organically over the years. Some of them had known him before he was famous. Others came in later. They traveled with him, lived at Graceland for extended periods, worked as his assistants, bodyguards, and companions. It was an unusual arrangement, part employment, part friendship, part something harder to define. Elvis paid their salaries and covered their expenses, but their relationships were genuinely close in ways that went beyond a simple employer and employee dynamic. The Memphis Mafia was predominantly white and Southern, which reflected the world Elvis had grown up in, but the circle around him was not exclusively that, and the professional relationships he maintained with black artists were not the distant, transactional kind that the music industry of the era typically produced between white stars and black performers. Little Richard spoke about Elvis publicly on multiple occasions over the years, and what he said was consistent. He described Elvis as someone who treated him with basic human respect at a time when that was not something a black performer could take for granted from a white star of Elvis's stature. The two men moved in overlapping professional worlds throughout the late 1950s, and Little Richard's account of those interactions was positive, in a way that seemed to come from actual experience rather than courtesy. Jackie Wilson was another figure whose relationship with Elvis carried genuine mutual respect. Wilson was one of the most gifted performers of his generation, a singer and dancer whose stage presence was extraordinary by any standard. Elvis watched him perform and was openly impressed. He talked about Wilson to people around him. Wilson, for his part, incorporated elements of Elvis's stage movement into his own performances, which created an interesting loop. Elvis had absorbed so much from black performers, and here was one of the greatest black performers of the era taking something back. The exchange went in multiple directions, the way it does between people who are actually paying attention to each other. B.B. King's account of Elvis is perhaps the most grounded, because King had known him the longest. King had seen the teenage Elvis on Beale Street before anyone outside Memphis knew his name. He watched him become the most famous entertainer in the world. And his assessment, given in various interviews over the years, was that Elvis had been genuine, that the love for the music was real, that the respect for the people who made it was real, and that this had been consistent from the beginning to the end. These are not small data points. Little Richard, Jackie Wilson, and B.B. King were not men who had obvious reasons to be generous toward Elvis if generosity wasn't warranted. They operated in an industry that had treated black artists unjustly for decades, and they were aware of that reality. When they spoke well of Elvis, they were doing so with full knowledge of the complicated context around him. James Brown's relationship with Elvis was less extensively documented, but ran along similar lines. Brown, who was as serious and uncompromising as any performer of his era, spoke about Elvis after his death in terms that suggested genuine regard. Muhammad Ali, who met Elvis in 1973 when both men were at points of significant transition in their lives, reportedly found him to be straightforward and warm in person, not performing friendliness for the cameras, but actually present in the conversation. What all of these accounts have in common is the word genuine. The people who interacted with Elvis across racial lines over extended periods in settings that were not public and not designed for appearances
came away describing someone whose regard for them felt real. That does not resolve the larger questions about Elvis's place in the racial economy of American music, but it fills in a part of the picture that gets lost when the conversation stays only at the level of industry structures and commercial outcomes. The people around him knew something about who he actually was, and what they said, consistently, pointed in the same direction.
The incident most often referenced when people talk about Elvis and race happened sometime in the mid to late 1950s in Memphis. The exact date is not recorded. The name of the restaurant varies depending on who is telling the story. What remains consistent across the accounts is the basic shape of what happened, and that consistency across multiple people who were present at different times for similar situations gives the story its weight. Elvis arrived at a restaurant with members of his group. Some of those members were black. This was not a calculated act of protest. It was simply how Elvis moved through the world by that point, with the people he was close to, without sorting them by race before deciding who was allowed to come through the door with him. The staff made the situation clear immediately. The black members of his group were not welcome inside. This was not a surprising position for a Memphis restaurant to take in the 1950s. It was the standard position. The law permitted it, the culture enforced it. Most white customers, including famous ones, would have accepted the arrangement without much thought, sent their black companions around to a separate entrance, or made some other accommodation and moved on with their evening. Elvis did not do that. By the accounts of people who were present, his response was quiet rather than dramatic. He did not raise his voice. He did not make a scene. He looked at the situation, understood what was being asked of him, and decided against it. He told his group that if they couldn't all eat there, none of them would. Then he left. He did not go to a different restaurant and find a more accommodating arrangement. He left entirely, and the people with him understood that his leaving was a direct response to what had just happened. This kind of account appears more than once in the recollections of people who spent time around Elvis during this period. The details shift slightly, different locations, slightly different circumstances, but the pattern is the same. When faced with a situation where his black companions were being treated as less than equal, Elvis removed himself from the situation rather than accept the terms being offered. Lamar Fike, one of the longer-standing members of the Memphis Mafia, spoke about Elvis's attitudes in interviews given years after Elvis's death. His account described the man who found the formal structures of segregation genuinely offensive on a personal level, not as an abstract political position, but as something that contradicted how he actually lived and who he actually cared about. Elvis had grown up alongside black neighbors, learned music from black artists, and maintained real friendships across racial lines. The formal demand that he treat those friendships as secondary to a restaurant's seating policy was something he simply wasn't willing to accommodate. It is worth being clear about what this was not. It was not a public act of civil disobedience. Elvis did not invite photographers. He did not issue a statement afterward. He did not contact the press to describe what had happened or use his platform to draw attention to segregation. The civil rights movement was active during this same period. The Montgomery bus boycott happened in 1955 and 1956, the same years Elvis was becoming famous, and there were people putting their physical safety on the line to challenge the same system Elvis walked away from that evening. His act was private, personal, and without consequence beyond the immediate moment. That distinction matters. Walking out of a restaurant is not the same as sitting at a lunch counter and refusing to leave while people pour things on you. The courage required is not comparable. Elvis faced no legal risk, no physical danger, and no professional consequences from his decision that evening. He simply chose not to eat at a restaurant that wouldn't serve his friends. That is a decent thing to do. It is not a heroic one. What it does tell you is something about his private character. The gap between what a person does when no one is watching and what they do when the cameras are on. Elvis made no public statement about race during the height of his fame, but in the private moments, the pattern of his behavior pointed consistently in one direction. He did not sort people by race when it came to who he spent time with, who he trusted, or whose company he valued. And when an external structure tried to impose that sorting on him, he rejected it. The restaurant that evening lost a customer. The people with Elvis went somewhere else and had dinner.
Nothing changed in Memphis that night as a result of what happened, but the moment stayed in the memory of the people who were there, and it stayed consistent with everything else they knew about him.
By the late 1950s, Elvis Presley was the most famous entertainer in America. His records were selling in numbers that no white artist had approached before, and his reach extended well beyond music into film, television, and popular culture broadly. He had a platform that very few people in the country could match. What he said publicly carried weight. What he chose not to say carried weight too. He chose not to say very much. On the subject of race, segregation, and the civil rights movement that was actively reshaping American society during the peak years of his fame, Elvis was largely silent. He did not give interviews addressing the racial dynamics of his music. He did not publicly acknowledge the debt his career owed to black artists in any sustained or specific way. He did not align himself with the civil rights movement, attend its rallies, lend his name to its campaigns, or use his extraordinary visibility to draw attention to what was happening in the streets of Montgomery, Birmingham, and Memphis. This silence was a choice. It may not have felt like one to Elvis at the time. He was not a political person by nature, and the machinery around him, managed primarily by Colonel Tom Parker, was not designed to encourage political engagement of any kind. Parker's entire strategy was built around keeping Elvis appealing to the widest possible audience, which in the American context of the late 1950s meant not alienating white Southern fans who supported segregation. Taking a public stand on civil rights would have been commercially risky in ways that Parker had no interest in navigating. But the fact that silence was commercially convenient does not mean it was without cost to others. The civil rights movement needed visible allies. White Southerners who were willing to stand publicly with black Americans carried particular weight precisely because of where they came from and what they risked by doing it. Elvis, a white Southern man with an enormous audience on both sides of the racial divide, was in a position that very few people occupied. He did not use it. At the same time, the picture is not as simple as pure silence. Elvis did things that, in the context of the American South in the 1950s, carried meaning even without words attached to them. He recorded black artist music at a time when that music was being kept off mainstream radio. He appeared on national television, performing in a style derived directly from black performance traditions, at a moment when those traditions were largely invisible to white mainstream audiences. He maintained personal relations across racial lines in a state where those relations were socially punished and in some cases legally restricted. Whether those acts constitute a meaningful form of resistance or simply a personal comfort that happened to have cultural side effects is a question without a clean answer. The honest position is probably somewhere in the middle. Elvis was not a civil rights activist. He was also not indifferent to the humanity of the black Americans around him. Both of those things were true simultaneously, and forcing them into a single verdict distorts the reality of who he was. The artists who knew him personally navigated this same complexity without apparent difficulty. B.B. King did not require Elvis to have been a civil rights activist in order to regard him as a decent man. Little Richard did not discount the respect he received from Elvis simply because Elvis never made a speech about segregation. They were capable of holding both the systemic critique and the personal experience at the same time, which is perhaps a more sophisticated position than the one often taken by commentators who knew Elvis only at a distance. What Elvis did consistently was treat the people immediately around him as full human beings, regardless of race. What he did not do was translate that personal decency into any form of public advocacy. The gap between those two things is real, and it represents a genuine limitation. Private goodness that stays entirely private does not change systems. It matters to the individuals involved, and it says something true about a person's character, but it does not move the larger structures that were causing harm on a massive scale. Elvis was a product of his time and his management in this respect. The version of him that emerges from the historical record is a man who was better in private than his public silence suggested, and who was also less willing to take risks on behalf of others than his platform would have allowed. Neither the generous reading nor the critical one captures the full picture on its own. He did what he did. He didn't do what he didn't do. The record holds both, and it is more useful to look at both clearly than to argue for only one of them.
That honest accounting is the only place from which the final question, about legacy, can be approached with any accuracy.
Elvis Presley died on August 16, 1977, at Graceland. He was 42 years old. The news reached the rest of the world within hours, and the response was unlike anything that followed the death of a public figure before or since. People gathered outside Graceland in the thousands. Radio stations played his music continuously. World leaders sent condolences. The scale of the grief was genuine and widespread, cutting across age, geography, and background in ways that surprised even people who understood how famous he had been. In the days and weeks after his death, something else happened alongside the public mourning. The people who had known him personally began to speak. Not the managed statements that come through publicists, but the actual recollections of people who had spent real time with him. Musicians, friends, collaborators, people from communities that had complicated relationships with his legacy. What they said, taken together, added something to the public record that the official image of Elvis had never quite captured. B.B. King gave several interviews in the period following Elvis's death. B.B. was not a man who softened his assessments for the sake of politeness. He had spent his entire career navigating an industry that had treated black artists unjustly, and he was clear-eyed about that reality. His account of Elvis was nonetheless warm and specific. He described the young white kid on Beale Street who came to listen and kept coming back. He described the man who, throughout his life, spoke about black music and black musicians with knowledge and genuine respect. King's verdict was not that Elvis had been perfect or that the racial dynamics around his career had been fair. His verdict was that the man himself had been real, that the love for the music was authentic, and that the personal respect was consistent. James Brown's public statements about Elvis pointed in a similar direction. Brown, if anything, was even less likely than King to offer unearned praise. He had built his entire career on an uncompromising assertion of black identity and dignity at a time when that assertion came with real costs. When Brown spoke well of Elvis, it carried weight precisely because of who Brown was and what he stood for. Little Richard, whose own relationship with the racial economy of 1950s music was deeply complicated, his songs had been covered by white artists, his style had been absorbed into the mainstream without adequate credit or compensation, spoke about Elvis in terms that distinguished between the system and the man. He was clear that the industry had not been fair. He was equally clear that Elvis, as a person, had treated him with respect. That distinction, coming from Little Richard, is not a small thing. Muhammad Ali's brief encounter with Elvis in 1973 produced a photograph that became well known. Two of the most famous men in the world standing together, both at complicated points in their lives. People who were present described the interaction as genuinely warm, two men who recognized something in each other across very different life experiences. Ali's later references to Elvis were positive, without being effusive. The assessment of someone who had met a lot of famous people and could tell the difference between performance and actual character. What all of these accounts share is a consistent separation between two things that often get collapsed into one in discussions of Elvis's legacy. The first is the structural reality of what his career represented. A white artist who achieved commercial success on a scale that black artists making the same music could not access, within an industry built on racial inequality. The second is the personal reality of how he conducted himself with the people around him. Those two things are both true, and they point in different directions, and the most honest assessment of Elvis holds both without resolving the tension into a single verdict. The music he made changed American popular culture in ways that are still visible. Rock and roll, as a commercial and cultural phenomenon, was built significantly on the foundation of what happened when Elvis's recordings reached a mass white audience in the mid-1950s. That opened doors for some black artists. The increased appetite for the music that Elvis had popularized created commercial space that artists like Chuck Berry, Little Richard, and Fats Domino were able to move into.
It also created a template in which the original sources of that music remained less visible and less compensated than the artists who carried it to mainstream audiences. Both of those outcomes are part of what Elvis's career produced. The doors that opened and the inequities that persisted existed in the same moment as results of the same set of events. What changed because of Elvis was real. What didn't change, the fundamental structure of how the music industry valued black creativity versus white commercial appeal, was also real and lasted well beyond him. He was one man inside a very large system. He was better than that system in his private conduct, and he was unable or unwilling to challenge it in any public way. The restaurant he walked out of remained segregated after he left. Memphis remained a divided city. The music industry continued operating on terms that disadvantaged black artists for decades after his death. And the music he made, built on foundations laid by people who were never fully credited or compensated, continued to move people in ways that crossed every line the world tried to draw around it. That is the full picture, not a simple one, but an honest one.